Hi guys, and welcome back to Mr. C's Accounting, where we're looking at natural resources. So examples of these are wind, coal, biomass, which is a fairly new one. If you don't know what biomass is, it has to do with plant particulate that is used to generate biofuel. There's many different ways that it can be used. I think the most popular right now is algae, which are used to generate alternative fuel sources. Very interesting stuff. Very, very complicated. Propane, uranium, water, natural gas, sunlight, and petroleum. So, future removal and site restoration costs. So, when we're looking at natural resources, these are sort of the big things that come to mind. Now, do you recall what separates natural resources apart as a capital asset from land, building, and equipment? It's that natural resources get used up, and afterwards steps have to be taken to remedy, I'm hesitant to say the damage, but depending on what is done, the damage or the aftermath of collecting those resources. For example, this is mining here. Some mining can be extraordinarily disruptive. Like it's called strip mining. It is a filthy, disruptive, horrible way of taking resources out of the planet. It's basically, I don't have a picture of it, but basically they just tear into the ground and they just dig a gigantic hole that just goes down and down and down and down and down. Really scars the planet. There are other ways of doing it, though, where afterwards they restore the land. Now, admittedly, this isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than the alternative. And so, for example, I did a lot of tree planting when I was younger before I had my back problems. That's what a tree planter's bag is, by the way. All the trees go in there. But mining companies will pay to have all of their equipment cleared out. All of this removed earth is put back in. The ground is reseeded and then replanted. Whoa. So in terms of future removal and site restoration costs, this typically refers to things such as, like I said, environmental cleanup. The term is reforestation, so fancy word for tree planting. So in accordance with the matching principle, these costs should be estimated in advance and be allocated over the useful life of the natural resource. Thus, these costs increase the amount of amortization in relation to the natural resource. But the way that it works is a little bit different from what you might expect. So, the amortization method for natural resources. The method generally used to calculate amortization of natural resources is units of activity, which is nice because you're familiar with this already. Remember, we talked about how equipment has an estimated unit of activity total. For example, a machine, once it's built, may be deemed to be able to produce 10,000 or 10 million or 100 million units of activity. Same concept is applied to natural resources. And the reason for that is that natural resource amortization is usually a function of the units extracted during the year. So it's not just a matter of time, it's a matter of what percentage or what amount of the natural resource is present in a particular area or a particular supply of natural resources that are available. So, for example, ABC Company, they're a very active company, lots and lots of transactions. We're going to call them ABC Coal Company now. Let's say they purchased a mine for $5 million. Now, that's an absurdly low amount, but I wanted to, make the math fairly easy. The mine is estimated to yield 10 million tons of coal. I don't know how much coal a mine yields, but let's just go with that. Now, there's residual value to this land, still has value. So let's just say it's $200,000. Now the restoration cost, this is where natural resources start to bring in new concepts that you haven't seen before. Now different mining sites and different sources of natural resources will have different restoration costs involved. For example, with natural gas, hopefully you guys know what natural gas is, but it's extracted using a method called fracking. Basically, they crack the ground open, usually underwater, and then they sort of send not seismic charges, but they send seismic impulses into the ground to loosen up the gas and allow it to come to the surface. Now, this can either be handled very cleanly or not at all, and can have devastating consequences depending on how it's done. But mining has a lot more restoration costs involved than fracking does, because with mining you're digging out a whole field or whatever. It's very obvious what has been done, and therefore it's very obvious how to undo it. With fracking, it's far more complicated than that. A lot of natural water supplies have been ruined as a result of fracking. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I just wanted to explain that different restoration costs and procedures will depend on what natural resource we're talking about. So in this example, in year 1, 800,000 tons of coal are extracted. So that's 800,000 units of activity. So in terms of amortizing this natural resource, step 1 is calculate the amortizable cost. So it is similar to how we've calculated amortizable costs in the past. The difference is that we have this restoration cost involved now. So the amortizable cost is equal to the total cost of the capital asset minus the residual value. So normally we would just stop here. If we were looking at, plants or equipment or land, we would just full stop right there. But with natural resources, we have this additional cost involved, the restoration cost, which is the cost of essentially trying to put it back to, quote, normal. I mean, it can never be put back to normal. We've taken something away, but, we try to undo some of the damage. Anyway, so equals to $5 million minus $200,000 plus $500,000. That's equal to $5,300,000. So that is our amortizable cost. You'll notice that the restoration cost increased the amortizable cost. Didn't decrease it, it increased it. Just something to keep in mind. Step 2, calculate amortizable cost per unit. So this is done in the exact same way as units of activity from our previous lesson. We have amortizable cost per unit is equal to the amortizable cost, we just found that right here, divided by total estimated units. And if you guessed that on your own, bravo. So this number will be very, very small. Therefore, cost of the mine, $5,300,000 divided by 10 million units of activity is equal to $0.53 per unit, or 53 cents. So we now have our amortizable rate, or amortizable cost per unit, I guess is probably the better way of putting it. Step 3 is calculate the amortization expense for the year. Now again, this natural resources do not depend on time as far as amortizations go. They depend on how quickly they're consumed. So in this case, we've consumed 800,000 units of activity, or tons of coal? Yeah, tons of coal. So 53 cents per unit times 800,000 units equals $424,000. So that is our current amortization expense for the year based on how many units have been consumed during that year. Next year it could be less, could be more, who knows. Okay, So the way we record this is we have our debit for amortization expense as per usual for the $424,000. Now here's where things get a little complicated. There are two corresponding entries to this debit of amortization expense. First is accumulated amortization just for the mine, which is $384,000, and part of our liability for restoration, the corresponding liability for restoration, I might add, of $40,000. The reason why we call it a liability is because this hasn't happened yet. We won't be restoring the mine until it's fully used up. So that's why it's a liability. This has not happened yet. Now you're wondering probably how I got these two different numbers. I will show you. There are two portions that make up that $424,000. There's the portion that pertains to the restoration. Now, that mine, when we bought it, had 10 million units of activity in it. And our restoration cost is $500,000. So what we need to do is calculate a dollar value of restoration per unit of activity. So for every unit of activity, there's a restoration value attached to it. We find that by dividing the total restoration cost by the total units of activity. So this will give us restoration dollars per unit of activity. We then times that by how many units of activity were consumed during the year. In this case, this gives us 0.05 times 800,000, which gives us 40,000. Now the portion that remains or pertains to the mine, we have the $5 million that we paid for the mine minus the 200,000 residual cost or residual value. So this is the amortizable cost divided by the 10 million units of activity. That will give us our amortizable cost per unit of activity times 800,000 units of activity. So that's the number of units of activity that were consumed in this year. So 4.8 million divided by 10 million times 800,000 is equal to 0.48 times 800,000 is equal to $384,000. So that is where those two numbers came from. I didn't just pull them out of thin air. And so basically what we're doing is we're calculating rates, like our restoration, the rate of restoration per units of activity and the rate of amortization per unit of activity, and then we just use those against how many units of activity were actually consumed. And so that's where I got these dollar values from. And that is it. That's natural resources, or should I say the amortization of natural resources. So I hope you found this video useful, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, bye.